we're now recording. So today we're going to be continuing with the IGL class, like I mentioned. Last time I covered the basics and the fundamentals, and I also covered some of these things, some of them to a higher degree than others. This is kind of more to give you more examples. This is to give you guys a little bit more preparation and to understand how to do this in tournament play. A lot of these things come into fruition for mid-round, and some of these just come into understanding how to just normally play. I've given you guys tips, like make sure you kind of when you're playing ranked, just kind of wait like 10 minutes, which is about 5 rounds. Usually you can get a decent idea on how your team is playing. You can figure out how they're doing, right? You can use that time to kind of figure it all out. For now, we're going to be looking into more specific examples. Okay, I'm going to be using numbers to kind of indicate the number of players that are within each side. I'm not going to try to color code them, but let's say this is like this. We have 1 player over here on B main and then 4 players going in on A main, right? That's basically what I'm going to do, just because I find that some players I'll just put in a comp and they'll be like, why did you have Neon and KO on A main? And it doesn't have to do with anything like that, okay? So I'm just going to be using numbers in case you're wondering why I'm not using particular players. Okay, so let's talk about IGLing in pro play.
What website are you using?
Sorry?
What website are you using?
This is Valorant. Okay, so you are more than welcome to kind of go in. It's free. You can follow along through there if you like. But in reality, it's just something that's just following the little arrows that I'm going to be pointing at, just simply so you can get a decent overview of how the map is played as you're kind of going through a round. Okay, so let's talk about one of the main concepts that we need to cover right off the bat. If you're new at IGLing, the biggest problem you're going to encounter is ghost comms, okay, and micromanaging. Both of these come from the aspect of players that don't know how much they should be talking to their team. Okay, there is a little scale that you need to follow, and one of them is freedoms, and the other one is micromanaging. Micromanaging in lower ranks is necessary, but like we've mentioned in the previous class, there needs to be some sort of trust established. There needs to be some sort of rapport. You guys should be able to do this maybe at the beginning when people are selecting their characters. You can kind of start right off the bat to see how they respond with, do you think we should go KO instead of X character, right? Stuff like that is really useful, okay, for getting started and understanding what they will be receptive to. What is IGL? IGL is in-game leading. Okay, so this is something we covered in a previous class. So this is just a continuation. An in-game leader is someone that is responsible for making calls, for basically attributing all the information that's going through a round, and essentially making calls and judgments based on how the team should play best. Okay, but like we just talked about, there is a little scale that they need to follow. They don't have control of everything that the team does. Okay. If you're in a tournament and you're with a team that you've been rehearsing with and you've been practicing and you've been doing a lot of plays with, this should be at its all-time high, okay? The scale goes from this even scale right here that goes in ranked to something more like this. Freedom is higher. There's more expression between players at a higher level, okay? If you've been playing in anything, for example, like in high immortal lobbies and maybe Radiant, you're going to notice that a lot of them already have an idea on what they're doing. Whether you want to say, that's arguable, that's just completely just personal bias. It happens, bad games, right? But at the end of the day, they have more understanding of the game than someone like Silver, right? And what needs to occur in these like tier 3, maybe tier 14 teams, but when they're doing a tournament, is they need to establish that freedom is important, okay? The IGL should not be really worried about what exactly it is that the team needs to be doing at all times. Okay, preparation is basically the main objective in these teams. What you're doing in preparation is setting up dry runs, setting up, for example, plays. And I always encourage teams, even if they don't have a coach, to maybe try to set up 1 to 2 different plays per side. And the way to do this is just either to think about it in the most simplistic way. Okay, let's rush and let's split. Those are 2 different plays, right? Or for example, cut noise and just kind of lurk, right? Like those are 2 different plays surrounding a particular side. And those are useful in essentially letting an IGL determine what's happening in previous rounds and sort of come up with a solution. This is the play we're going to do and hope that it all goes all right. Turns out that we have really bad money and they have a really strong side here and a really strong hold here, but their mid is weak. Let's just rush it, right? Something simple, something that they can use to kind of prepare the team ahead of time. And this is something that everybody else can follow. we've mentioned before that when you are playing as an IGL, when you are playing someone that's going to be playing as an IGL, we've talked about a couple things. Number one, we talked about, hey, we don't really have objectives, right? Like objectives are things that we need to really mention. We need to make sure that goals are set in stone, right? So in ranked, you always got to make sure that sight is being placed. Same thing in tournament play. Sight is the objective. Usually this is changed last second by the IGL if something occurs. 3 people push this way and they die. Well, that means that we can probably take A, or at the very least, it's weaker from this side, right? Something like that. Objectives rarely, goals rarely change. Objectives, however, is where you as an IGL tend to shine. It is how you are going to take that side, okay? So preparation in the objectives is key and it's crucial off server. So this is off a tournament, this is off a game, this is something you can practice in a scrim or in your own time in a custom game. This is something that you guys need to make sure that you do. Preparation is super easy, okay? All you have to do is that you have to make sure that you practice 3 different things for your IGL to be able to work just right. And the main goal with preparation is to make sure your players are autonomous, okay? So the first one is getting sequencing right, okay? Sequencing is anything from who swings first to who is playing for a particular thing. So for example, let's say that we have 2 players, we have Gecko and Jet. Sequencing would be something as simple as flash first, swing after, right? The sequencing of events that needs to occur when something is going, right? The second thing that needs to happen is something that we like to call contingency plans. Okay, I'm not going to try to spell the word. Let's see. So contingency plans are basically a backup plan. What happens if it goes wrong? If your entire plan, like we mentioned, we already had that freedom. We want to make sure that they know what we're doing. We just have the preparation of we're going to be doing a B split. And we're like, okay, we're going to do the play. And your team knows that they just have to swing here. They know the sequence. They've done this dry run a million times. And your Jet dies. Well, the rest of the plan included them kind of pushing through with the Jet, but they're gone. They're dead. So what do we do here? What is the backup plan? Do we still continue? Do we continue to try to push forward? Do we use a previous concept from one of the classes? Do we pivot some of the players that we have over here on B and move them over? Do we have a lurk that we have move over with us, right? These are things that we have to utilize, and we have to make sure that we're using at all times when we're preparing ahead of time. Okay, we got to make sure that we ask what if questions, because as an IGL, the only time that you really come into play is if these contingencies need to happen, right? Same thing. Let's say that you made the play at the beginning of the round, something we talked about. You're pretty much giving them objectives. We're going to be doing this. They're ready to go. It fails. You guys get stopped at this point right here. As an IGL, you have the backup plan ahead of time that you should be able to just cut this play short, and we should be able to make some sort of rearrangement, whether it's a default, whether it's lurking, cutting noise, re-hitting, any of these things, you have that in mind. And that's what contingency plans really try to do. This is what they try to accomplish when you're trying to play in a tournament game. Okay, and the last but not least is your setup. Setup is something that you can use on both attack and on defense. Okay, attack and on defense, both of them really kind of have a separate way on how setups work. The setup can be what happens after post plant, what happens after, at the beginning of the round, what's our initial setup, what happens if we lose a particular player, what happens if we have a certain ult, for example. This all falls under preparation. So if you're a new IGL that's trying to land themselves in a spot in a team, you got to make sure that you're aware that a lot of the responsibilities that you have are essentially making these last second calls, okay? Making sure the team knows what exactly is going to be happening. The rest of it is already pre-made for you, so there shouldn't be this feeling of anxiety that you're going to lead someone the wrong way, because you've already prepared these plans. You just have to execute them. Hey, this failed, retreat. Simple as. It doesn't have to continue with you telling them, hey, that guy died, can you use wingman for this and that? No, that doesn't have to happen, because you've already told them what the plan is, but you've already prepared ahead of time prior to this game. So they should know they need to use the wingman, or maybe they know that they just have to pick up the dizzy and then retreat, right? Maybe it's something along the lines of them stopping the play and then moving over to A, right? Something along those lines, but it's something that they continue to do just simply because they know the play, because you've practiced it before. Okay. So if you have any players by any chance that are struggling with IGLing and they want to go past just ranked IGLing, you got to make sure that you let them know. Okay. A lot of the struggles of an IGL don't fall within the match themselves. They've already been prepared. They just have to make sure they're confident in the call. And like I mentioned before in the previous class, part 1, it's a gut feeling. It's okay to make mistakes. That's why scrims are done. And you have to do multiple reps. Okay. You have to do multiple reps. So with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit more of the examples that we can use when it comes to goals and objectives, reeling, and disengage. Okay. All of these 3 are applicable on both ranked and tournament play. I'm going to just be essentially giving you guys a little bit more on the topic. Okay. So you guys have a little bit more to work with. When we were talking about goals and objectives, I mentioned that you should have a goal, which is generally a site or a lane that you're trying to hold. And then you have objectives or site objectives, whatever you want to call them. Something that works basically to the extent of getting the goal. When you are playing and you're trying to get this goal in mind, you should let your team know ahead of time that there are 3 things that they need to do. And usually the way that I mentioned it, at the very least, is that you need to basically give them 3 things that the team needs to do. It doesn't have to be things that the team needs to do. It's sometimes things that they need to be aware of. So for example, it could be something as simple as letting them know that there is a danger of a potential op over on mid. It could be something as simple as put the camera here because I'm afraid of someone crossing over from a previous round. It could be something as, hey, they like to lurk or they like to push up over on A, right? These are things that as an IGL, you need to make sure that you're planning ahead of time and you're letting them know. Usually you should look at it in terms of a hierarchy, and the more pressing ones need to be set first. Okay. So for example, if your team died because of a lurk, this should be stated. We need to have 4 players on one side and 1 on the other, just making sure we watch out for that guy because that's actually the reason they won the round last second. Okay. Or maybe it's, can you smoke mid, right? Because we realized that this was a problem. Right? Sometimes you don't even have to tell them to smoke. Sometimes you can just tell them, watch out for that person mid. And sometimes your controller will tell you, should I smoke it? Or somebody is going to go, for example, your initiator is going to go, do I dart it? Do I flash it? Right? Stuff like that. Right? My best guess as to how players tend to function best. I remember that I was watching a stream from FNS a while ago, and I'm just going to tell you what he said. He said that it's better to post things as questions. Okay. Because more players are bound to be more receptive because they think their opinion matters. And I'm not saying their opinion doesn't matter. I'm just saying that they feel included. Okay. They feel included in the opinion that's going to happen after. So it's like, do you think it would be best if we put a smoke up ahead on mid? And they're going to think, yeah, because you said there's an op mid, right? So that's one way that you can engage your team with the objectives that are at hand. It's actually really difficult to get players that don't listen. And most of the time, sometimes they will think that you're playing them like they're stupid or something like that. You have to make sure that you read the room. It's really difficult for some players to do so. And it's something as simple as, listen, if they're running it down or they insta-lock and they're not really talking back at you, then they don't really care. They're not really attempting to get any of that stuff done. They're not really trying to make a play with you guys. They're just playing the game. Maybe they just want to mess around. Maybe they want to practice their aim. Maybe they got a new mouse pad. Who knows? There's something happening in that game that is not letting you do what you need to do as an IGL. This is both in ranked and sometimes in tournaments. Somebody will just tune you guys out because they're tilted. Something went wrong. So what you need to do is you need to work with the people that do actually care. And that's where you use those questions. Get that response from them. Get that idea from them. Hey, I noticed that you were holding the lurk, but you left really early. Right? You can say something like, it would be best maybe. Do you think it'd be best if we just hold it a little longer next time? Or do you think that, like, you know, you can kind of just go from there, right? Do you think it was just ideal to move from there, right? Try to look for different ways in which you can pose the question. It's just like, hey, you know, you kind of left early. What was that, right? Like, why'd you leave, right? Ask them questions. Figure out what exactly it is that made them tick on that particular situation. Because I find that sometimes they're really passive aggressive. You shouldn't have done that. That was really bad. You costed us the round. Don't do that, okay? It costs a lot of more rounds than just that one, okay? And this is where goals and side objectives really needs to go for a lot of players. If you feel like you still have a hard time practicing this, instead of doing 3, like I mentioned before, just do 1. What was the most pressing thing in that round? It was probably the op. Okay, well, talk about the op. Talk about the op for 20 seconds before the round starts. Okay, the problem was the op. The op is not letting us do this. The op is not letting us do that. Start somewhere, get your nerves out of the way, and over time, you'll start getting a lot more concise, a lot more consistent. Your words will be less when you're trying to communicate something. And with that, you'll be able to express the problem much earlier. Okay, second thing, let's talk about reeling. I didn't really talk about reeling all that much. I just mentioned that it is a good tool that IGLs have as a way to basically bring teammates back. The way that you have to think about reeling, okay, you have to think about reeling like this. When you're basically fishing, you're reeling the fish and you're bringing them back, okay? You're bringing them to you. A good example of reeling is, let's say, for example, you guys take sight and you know that there are dangers ahead that we haven't cleared yet. And this is where you come in and you go, okay, it is probably not ideal for you to pass Boba, for example, in this scenario. Reeling would be a good way to prevent teammates from overextending, from taking fights that are not ideal, from situations where they are not capable of maybe taking multiple fights at once, right? These multiple lanes, think of it as an intersection, multiple lanes to kind of worry about, someone peeking over here, right? Multiple lanes to kind of worry about. Reeling is also a good tool for you to find out the limit of not only you when you're reading the minimap, but also the limit of your teammate, okay? One thing that you can do is, if you're struggling with reeling, in tournament play, I would always tell someone, try to have someone buddy system, which is essentially have a player play alongside them, try to make sure that they're not doing anything too wrong, because they're going to communicate back and forth and ideally prevent themselves from either dying alone or at least getting a trade, right? It's going to prevent them from losing a lot of numbers when they get aggressive. Reeling should be a tool that you use when you're trying to prevent teammates from making more mistakes than they already have, okay? Try to use it as a tool. That will essentially help you keep numbers at your advantage and keep players from dying in silly ways. Does anyone have any questions before I jump into disengage? Any questions at all? We've talked about freedom. We've talked about preparation. We've talked about goals and objectives. We've touched on that a little more. And of course, reeling. We're going to talk about one last topic. Does anyone have any questions on this, on anything so far?
No.
Nope. Perfect. Okay. One last bit. Let's talk about disengage. I think disengagement is one of the harder topics for little IGLs who are just starting, because they don't really know where to stop. Okay. And we're going to highlight it in terms of positioning, and we're going to be using attack as an example, but we'll start moving forward from there. As an attacker, this right here where you start, we're going to call the green zone. Okay. The green zone is perfectly safe. Anything that you do in there is going to be all right, especially at the beginning of the round. There's no problems. If you haven't let go of any space, right? So for example, if you've basically done your job and put trips, maybe left a lurk, maybe had people watching, right? If you started as a default, if you keep space controlled, this will always be free for you guys. Anything that happens in this zone is completely up to the players that you have to make decisions with. Okay. You can see that depending on the map, there's varying degrees of how much this green zone that you have. Like, you're going to notice that the green zone can be very spacious and it can give you a lot of options, or it can be really small, right? It is up to you to kind of identify what that green zone is. And it is important for you to notice what the green zone is, okay? Because when you are playing, this needs to be your backup plan. Because the second bit is, we're going to go back to sunset. The second bit is identifying the yellow zone. The yellow zone is every spot that's highly contested. Okay. Now I could put it in red to mean like hotspot or danger zone, but it's yellow because it's right in the middle, right? You can fight for it. It can be yours, or it can be theirs, depending on how it's played. The yellow zone is perhaps one of the easiest spots for players to find themselves dead, or the easiest spot for them to feel like they have an advantage. It's one of those spots that it could be give or take. Okay. When you're playing, most of the time, the mid round revolves around the yellow zones. Okay. If you are late in the round and you are reliant on a green zone, when you have you're relying on taking back a green zone, I should mention, then you're doing something wrong. It is actually very difficult to play knowing full well that, for example, this is no longer yours. For example, a late rotation. Anything could happen. There's a lot of elements at play, and there's too many variables to consider. So when we're looking at the yellow zones, you got to make sure that you at the very least have some control, or you have some sort of artificial control. So for example, you have a trip, so they know that they can't push past the zone, so this is still contested, because they could push past this, because, you know, they don't know you're here, or something like that, right? It could go both ways. You know that you can't push forward, you know, that's the same thing. And on defense, it's the same thing. If you're starting on the sites, that's your green zone. Same thing with your spawn, that's your green zone. The opposite side, the enemy spawns where the enemy is at the beginning, that's the red zone. So on defense, it would be the enemy spawn, and for attackers, it would be the sites. Okay, you're going to notice that there's a lot of red. Okay, there's a lot of red for attackers to deal with. Okay, on defense, you start with a lot of green, but it's also very easy to lose. A lot of easy mistakes can kind of have a problem. You can lose a lot of space really quickly. Goodbye, Nico. Okay, so with that out of the way, right? When you understand these red zones right here, this is where you have to find that zone where the yellow and the red meet. This area right here, something like this, something like this, something like this. These areas right here are really, really, really dangerous. Okay, and they are where most of the plays can either go your way or the enemy's way. This is where you need to have the most preparation, or at the very least have an idea of what's going on. So for example, if you cross the zone, your jet, you cross the zone and you tap, do they have anything to deal with you? Do they have trips? Do they have an ult? Are they expecting you to cross up to this point because they have a flash, right? This is where the danger starts becoming a little bit more menacing. And this is where you guys need to be very aware of this area right here. Disengagement is understanding these zones right here and being ready to cut the play whenever things go wrong. It is up to you, however, to set the standards of what breaks the play. So for example, let's say you need the jet entry and she dies right here. You can cut the play. Perfectly acceptable to do so. Let's say you are ready to push in and they give you guys a one-way, or maybe they just smoke it all together. I don't know, one or the other. But they add a molly. You can cut the play because you can't start here, right? Or maybe you're going this way and they retaliate with, I don't know, let's say fade ult or something like that. I don't know, I can't control the enemy. Let's say they fade ult, right? Since you haven't crossed these lines right here, you're still perfectly capable of giving up the yellow and coming back to these green zones. Okay, and you're going to notice that one thing that might be coming up to your mind is simply, well, if we're really late in the round and we're not keeping control of the other side of the green, then it's a problem. So would it be ideal to have 4 once? And I would say, yeah, it's perfectly acceptable to think about that. Okay, if you have a sentinel and you have them lurk, that's fine. If you have a controller that has like long reach smokes, you can definitely do that, right? If you have a Reyna that likes to lurk, you can use that to your advantage, right? Stuff like that. Make sure that you're fully aware that cutting the play requires your team to be acknowledging the opposite side of the map, or at the very least acknowledging that they can leave at any point in time. Okay, a really notorious map for this I've noticed with teams that are still getting started is Icebox. They seem to kind of have a hard time understanding the difference between the yellow lines and the red lines, right? And what happens is they think that they can cut the play when they are right here, right? And sure, you can do that, but at the same time, I find that a lot of players have a really hard time understanding on where they should be cutting the play. And most often than not, they lose a lot of players. Or they don't know that they can stop themselves from engaging when there's danger, and instead they overcommit. They're like right here, for example, they're like in this area and they're like, well, they already know we're here, so let's just continue pushing, right? Icebox is one of those big ones that you can use to kind of determine if they're really good at getting that line right. Right, so you can say this is an area where they're going to be fighting, and this area right here is the site. Right, you can admit that this area right here, once they pass pipes, that's that that's that line that you can cut. Right, that's the zone you can cut through. So when you're playing Disengage, play around with these lines and try to pay attention to what exactly it is that they respond to, how far it is that they need to go to, what lengths do they need to go through in order to be able to push. Okay, kind of make some notes as to how far they need to cross before they start being more receptive. Are they receptive when you tell them early? Are they more receptive before the play starts and you tell them this doesn't look like a good idea? Okay, a lot of chances need to be kind of played on the team when you don't really know them. But like I mentioned, there's a lot of autonomy. There's a lot of freedom in tournament play. So they should be more receptive. They should be aware that they have a lot of freedoms. They can sacrifice just pushing just this once. That respect, okay, and that trust within you and the IGL between you and the teammate needs to be there. So I have a question right here. Yellow stop is actually not bad for faking, though with taking that, you gain too much space with that. Wait, what? Sorry, I just read it and that just kind of got me confused. But I think I know what you're saying. You're basically saying it's a great place for you to have a fake, right? Because it's a good place for you to kind of indicate that you were going to have some intention with the push, right? But at the end of the day, you backed out. Perfect. It's a good analysis of exactly what it is because this is how far most of the pushes go. You can use this to fake. You can use this to retreat. Be my guest. So yeah, good analysis. I like that. Do I have any questions about disengagement, about cutting a play, about cutting it short, about bringing your team back? And yes, if you're wondering, telling them to come back from here is a form of reeling. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask?
Nope.
Nope. Not from you. Nobody else? Perfect. All right, we're going to call it here. That was it. That was the big thing. I just wanted to make sure that we covered those extra little bits right there, just because I've had some questions about the IGLing and tournament play and a little bit more on the examples of things. All right, we're going to call it here. I'm going to close this.